For those of you that don't know, my name is Chad Ubel. I'm the Community Services Director for the City of Winona. I just want to go over a couple thank yous and a couple logistic items before we get started. I wanted to point out tonight that we intentionally decluttered the library. And when I mean declutter the library, we did that for two main reasons. One is so that we could fill it with people. And two was to bring out the beauty of the library and its architecture and its interior beauty. Oftentimes, I would assume, I do on a daily basis, come into this facility. You may come in, use the public computers, check out a book, and not notice that we have several wood columns. Or you may forget to look up and see the dome. And so, again, tonight intentionally decluttered, so I hope that you take the time to look and aesthetically enjoy the library tonight as well. I want to... First and foremost, I want to thank the Friends of the Winona Public Library for making this event possible tonight. And more specifically, I want to thank Julie Johnson for her work in writing the grant and seeing this idea and concept through to fruition. I'd like Julie to come up just for a quick minute and make an announcement, and then we'll continue.
I don't have a mic, so
Here,
maybe I do. Can you hear me? Hi, thanks, Chad. Yeah, I'm a grant writer, and I'm happy to write grants for the library and for the Friends of the Library. And I'm on the board of the Friends. Tonight, Greg is doing a presentation about the history of the library, and part of that grant is that he wrote a manuscript of this history. And then as a Friends group, we went ahead and applied for a grant and received it from the Winona Foundation to publish his manuscript into a book. And I'm happy to say the whole manuscript is done and it's at the editor. So we should hopefully have the book by the end of this year. And I wanted to let everyone know there's a Friends brochure. It's here tonight on some of the counters. It will always be at the front circulation desk. There's the member form on the back, but it has room for your name, address, phone number. And there's a box to check if you want to be contacted when the book is available. We will be selling it here at the library. So thank you.
I would be remiss not to thank the entire staff of the public library for their daily for their daily work, their creativity in decorating this building tonight, and certainly ownership of this project. And then finally, a group that I feel is often overlooked in this process, and that's our building maintenance staff. Josh, Riley, Corbin, and Nick have put their best foot forward to make this building shine tonight. So whether it... This event and the culmination of the history of the library was made in part by grant dollars from the Legacy Amendment. And those Legacy Amendment dollars go to Selco, and then the library in turn writes a grant to Selco, and thankfully we were awarded those grant dollars. But it is important to note that those were Legacy Amendment dollars that contributed in part to this project. Our speaker tonight will introduce, in his introduction, will touch on the thoughts and ideas of why we submitted this grant, and of course, as Julie had mentioned, how it's evolved into the future of the publishing of the book. I've worked for the city of Winona for 18 years, and I think it's safe to say that this has been the most enlightening project that I have been involved in. And that is directly related to Greg Gaut. He has left no stone unturned in his research of the public library, and he has this great ability to draw you into the story, and after listening to the story or that piece of information, you immediately want to ask 10 follow-up questions. It would be a huge understatement to say it's been my pleasure to work with Greg Gaut on this project. So if you could, please join me in welcoming Greg Gaut.
For about 6 months now, I've been working on this history of the Winona Library, and as Chad explained, it really arose out of conversations between Chad and Julie and I really want to thank them for all their help and support, especially for the grants that they together worked on. Much of the research I did was done right here in this library. And you may remember some news articles from a year or so ago about how the library staff and Chad found an amazing number of artifacts. And mostly they were in this room right here. This is the old library director's office, and in that office there's a vault. And in that vault was all kinds of interesting things that we use, some of which are now under the glass on tables around the library, and over here there's a display with some of those things. And they were a great use. And so I spent a lot of time here in the library, and when I was here, I was kind of the guest of the library staff. And they did a great job of making me welcome, doing everything they possibly could to help me in my research. And so I want to, again, as Chad has already done, thank them because they were really extremely helpful. And I want to mention Deb Lilla, Holly Hines, Leslie Dahlke, Linda Wyman, Sandy Pilarski, Teresa Stevens, and Sam Tierbeest, and also Riley Stakal, who was really so helpful to all of us. He took me on a tour of what's above that dome in all kinds of places. It was really great. I also want to mention that when I was working on this project, a strange thing happened, which is that my wife, Marcia Neff, and I decided to move to Minneapolis. And so when Marcia and I came to Winona in 1994, we were just remembering that, you know, one of the things that we loved about Winona most right away was this building. And Marcia's been a great help to me with coming up with a lot of good ideas about how to proceed with this, and I want to thank her also. But then after we moved to Minneapolis, I continued to work in that room and had to come down from the cities quite a bit. And I want to thank Doug Nopar and Joanne Thomas and Kathy and Chris Carroll for hosting me and giving me encouragement on those many trips down here to continue the research. So now, as Chad said, I was going to explain what are we up to? Why are we doing this? So the idea arose to produce a history of this library, and I think there was basically two reasons. The first reason is that this building, this library, this institution should have a history. No matter what, it's a great story. It's been going on for about 150 years. And we can learn a lot about ourselves in this town from the history of the Winona Library. So just for its own merits, it should be done. But there was a second thing too, and that is that libraries everywhere, and Winona Library is no exception by any means, are struggling a bit now. And they're increasingly underfunded, struggling with issues of space, etc. And we felt that a close look at the history of this library, which is quite a story, would help raise public awareness about the library and hopefully contribute to a movement to strengthen, upgrade, expand this library and make it everything it can be. And frankly, your presence here tonight indicates to me that we're on the right track of trying to do exactly that. Even though there's still no book, the book is basically exists here in this manuscript, which I carry around, but it really does exist in that form. Now, the linchpin of that story that we want to focus on, the connecting link between the past and the present, is this building itself and how it came to be. How did Winona get this building? Which brings us to the philanthropy of this man, William Harris Laird, who was one of the three founders of the Laird Norton Company, one of the, well, actually the most successful of the three big lumber companies that dominated the Winona riverfront in the second half of the 19th century. And now, hopefully, most of you by now have gotten a piece of paper that's been handed out, which is basically a chapter outline of the book. And in each of the chapters, there's just a little summary of what goes on in the book. I did this in order to give you a sense of what the big picture is, because obviously I won't be able to talk about every part of this 150-year history tonight, but it gives you a little bit of sense of where we're at and what the story is. And what we see when we look at the history of the Winona Library, or really any library, is that it's part of a much larger story about the United States, a much larger story about the development of the institution of free public libraries that happened at the end of the 19th century, and also a much larger story about what happened to those institutions as the next century wore on, and now we're into another century yet. And so there's these big picture things, but then every library has its own unique story. And so what I tried to do is to touch on both those things. There's the big picture of what's going on in the country about this question of libraries and their crucial role in the formation of a democratic republic, and then the unique story about Winona and how Winona dealt with those particular things. So here's the basic story. All across the United States, in the middle of the 19th century, as these towns around here were being developed, and Winona was no exception, there were libraries. People organized libraries right away. But they were what we call subscription libraries. That is to say, you paid a fee, or some people paid a fee, for the privilege of borrowing books. And so they were basically middle class and pretty small operations. And in Winona, there was various ones going back to the early days of Winona, and then after the fire in 1862, another one got started, and it was called the Young Men's Library Association. And it's 1863. So basically, it was a group of guys who formed a group to have a library, a subscription library, where people paid a $2 fee per year, or some people did, for the privilege of borrowing books. But that fee was not enough to work, to make the whole thing work, and so they also did lots of fundraising. They were doing fundraising all the time. Strawberry festivals, concerts, what they called Dickens entertainments, and then lecture series. And one of those lecture series in 1867 is very interesting because they brought to Winona a series of lectures, including two of the most famous people in the United States who lectured right here in Winona, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Frederick Douglass. In 1867, we're part of a lecture series. And partially this was to obviously, enlighten and raise the intellectual level of the town, but also they were fundraisers. Eventually, actually almost right away, women became involved in the, quote, Young Men's Library Association, and became a bigger and bigger part of the work of the library. And frankly, eventually, the creation of the public library movement and libraries across America and really running libraries over the last 150 years really became the work of women primarily. All right? So in 1873, the Young Men's Library Association changed its name to the Winona Library Association, kind of recognizing what had really happened. But because it was so hard to keep this thing going with all this fundraising, in 1875 it fell on kind of bad times, and it actually closed for a while. And then three women came forward and were appointed kind of an emergency executive committee by the board and basically saved the library, got it going again with their hard work. One of those women was named Charlotte Prentice. She was then in her 20s, and her engagement with the library was only just beginning. She was going to go on to become a member of the board for many years, and then in 1899 she surprised everybody by retiring from the board and becoming a full-time assistant librarian. Which she did until she married a Laird Norton executive by the name William Hayes, and I think it was in 1903. Unfortunately, both William Hayes and Charlotte Prentice were older when they married, and only 7 years later she died in 1910. And William Hayes then hired Kenyon Cox, who was a nationally famous mural painter, to paint a mural. And about half of the audience right now, if it looks up, can see this mural and the inscription to Charlotte Prentice Hayes. And the rest of you, when you're mingling afterwards, I urge you to take another look at it. It's one of the really important works of art that we have in the library. Well, meanwhile, there was a public library movement all across the United States and in Winona too. And what that meant was that people were campaigning to get state legislatures to pass a law that would allow a city to tax its population to support a library, which up until that time a city or a county could not do. And finally in 1879, Minnesota passed that law. And finally in 1886, the Winona City Council went along and formed the Winona Free Public Library and created a library board. All right, so 1886 is when this library went from being a subscription library to a free public library. And the number of borrowers, the size of the collection, all that took off because subscription libraries were very small. There was never more than 300 subscribers. Suddenly, lots of people, because it was now the free public library, were getting library cards, and the place was really going great guns. But this was the library. And so the library was in various places, and now, when in 1886, when the Winona Free Public Library took over, it was in this building, which was a former school building at 4th and Lafayette. And you see it says Winona Library there. It was rickety, it was drafty, apparently it was very cold and uninsulated in the winter and hot in the summer, and always massively inadequate. And the library board was always telling the city that something had to be done about this. And this, by the way, this library is right at the site of the present City Hall. And so this set the stage for William Harris Laird's gift to the city of Winona of this library building, which he announced in 1897. But there was an important middleman in this whole process that I want to mention. And that's this fella, Frederick S. Bell, who was a young lawyer from Iowa who came to Winona to practice law, quickly got involved with the Laird Norton Company, and then worked his way up, eventually became the president of the Laird Norton Company later on, and also married a daughter of William Harris Laird, Frances Laird. And so he, in addition to being a Laird Norton executive, was also on the board of the Winona Free Public Library. In fact, he was the chair of the board of the Winona Free Public Library. In fact, he led the library board from 1884. Actually, he was on the Winona Library Association board and then on the Winona Free Public Library board in 1886, all the way till 1906. And behind the scenes, it's very clear that he talked to his father-in-law, William Harris Laird, about the problem with the Monroe School Building and the Winona Library's desperate need for better digs, and obviously prevailed upon his father-in-law to see that this was his responsibility to do something about. And that's what happened. So I think it was probably on the Christmas holidays in 1894 when William Harris Laird was back east, as they used to say, for the holidays. He met with his nephew, Warren Powers Laird, who was an architect and actually the dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, and asked him if he wouldn't be interested in designing a library for Winona. Now, Warren Powers Laird had actually grown up here. He had gone to the normal school, and then he went back east to go to college, and then eventually studied architecture in Paris, and then eventually got involved with the University of Pennsylvania Architecture School. And he was very interested in doing that. And so during 1895, 96, 97, behind the scenes, there's all this correspondence between Winona and Philadelphia planning this building and thinking through the whole process. All behind the scenes, nothing had gone public yet. And then finally, in early 1897, in what the local newspaper called a sweet surprise, Laird offered publicly to build this building for the city and turn it over to the city if the city would agree to do several things. And here's what they were. First, he asked that the city buy the property at 4th and Lafayette, that old rickety building, from the library board for $5,000. And then the city would own that property, and of course later on the city used that property to become City Hall. And in return, he said, he would sell this property that we're all on right now to the library board for the same amount, even though it was really worth more. And so then the library board then would be, without it spending any money, in control of this property. And thirdly, he asked that the city increase the tax levy for the library from 3/8 of a mil on the personal and public property valuations of the city to 1 mil for 10 years, and thereafter to never less than 1/2 mil. And so his point was to secure a suitable site for the library, this site, and to guarantee long-term support for the library over the years in perpetuity. When the library was finished, a ceremony was held here, very quiet ceremony, just with the library board and the city council, January 1899, and Laird transferred ownership of the building to the library board to have and to hold forever, subject only to the conditions stated above, which the city council had agreed to. So, what did the city get? Well, we've had a good chance to get a sense of that tonight. For the reasons Chad mentioned, of kind of trying to think a little bit about what this library was like in its early years. What the city got was a very imposing Renaissance Revival building, sheathed in Bedford limestone, with a dramatic central dome. And in that central dome, again, my apologies to the front half of the audience, but later on, take a look at that dome again. It was designed by a guy named Otto Heinecke, who was a major art glass designer in New York City, whose work is in Carnegie Hall and all kinds of places, and also in the Winona Library. And 2 levels of space, plus behind this door here, a 3-level stack room for the books. Now, I wanted to show you just for a second, because it's kind of fun. Oh, there it is, by the way, in its early days. You can see that the streetcar tracks ran right out in front of the library, which was a good thing about its location. But anyway, this is a floor plan of the library, and I know not all of you will be able to read this, but let me just point out a few things. So here's the way the library was set up originally. So here's the main entrance, which you came in today, and here's where we all are now, what was called the exchange room. The exchange room was seen as kind of a lobby as you entered the library, but also right here was the exchange desk. So kind of where that divider is here, there was a desk, and that was basically the circulation desk for the library. And all this space back here where I'm standing was kind of librarian's territory, all right? And then this whole area here, all that's here, was a large reading room, right? And here's the reference room here. And then the art room, which we still call the art room, was conceived to be not a place for books at all, but an actual art gallery. And the people who originally designed this library and the library board really wanted this library to also be a full-time art museum. And in the middle of the art gallery, there was a spiral staircase that went down to the lower level, which we lost sometime during the 40s. And then here we have the stacks, the original stack room back here. It's been enlarged since then, okay? And then in the basement, very interesting, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Below the art room, at the end of that spiral staircase, was a thing called the cast room, where the idea was to show sculpture art down there. In the middle was the mechanicals. Here was where the trustees met. And this whole area down here, which is the present-day children's library, was a lecture hall that could seat 250 people. kind of an audience like this tonight, and that was the point. There was continual lectures, both from the library and from other organizations in town using that lecture hall. All right? So just a few pictures of, I really thought it was interesting what Chad said, because I've noticed as I write a lot about buildings, and when you come into a building like this a lot, like I have, you start taking it for granted. And it's a really good idea every once in a while to, as David Laird once said, look up Winona and take a look at the detailing around here, not only the dome, but the wood detailing. Obviously, this building was donated by William Harris Laird, who was a major lumber manufacturer, and all the millwork came from the Laird Norton shops on the riverfront, and they were really good at it. And it's remarkable, especially these wood pillars. And so you can see the early rooms, what they look like. Here's the reading room with the original furniture, the newspapers, etc. And that's the exchange desk that I mentioned. There's the art room through there, the original light fixtures, etc. It's very interesting. And here's the art room. Like I said, it was meant to be an exhibit hall for art, and apparently Hannibal Choate, the department store guy, had a big art collection, and as soon as the building opened, he immediately petitioned the library board if he could show his art in the art room, and apparently they gave him that chance in 1899 to do that. But throughout the years, there was continual exhibits in the art room, and obviously that continues up till the present day. I want to just make a stop there now with the chronology and just make a few observations about this. First off, this act of philanthropy that William Harris Laird did in 1897 was really part of a much larger engagement of wealthy and powerful Winonans in the public library and other similar institutions. So back in those days, rich people spent a lot of their time sitting on, say, the library board, deciding whether the bill from Jones and Kroger for $25 should be paid this month or not. This is exactly what they did. And by the way, we have the minutes of these meetings for all those years, and it's very interesting to go through them. Let me just give you one example of what I'm talking about when I talk about the civic engagement of upper middle class, wealthy, powerful people in this town with something like the library board. In 1886, when the Winona Free Public Library was begun, the mayor appointed a new library board. He picked a lot of people who had been involved in the subscription library board from before that time. But here is what the first library board was. It was chaired by Fred Bell, who was a Laird Norton Company executive, as we've already mentioned. Also on that board was Matthew Norton, one of the three founders of the Laird Norton Company, and by this time, a recognized millionaire. And folks, when you were a millionaire in 1899, it meant a lot, all right? William Mitchell was on the board. William Mitchell is the person about who the law school in St. Paul is named. He was a Winonan, and at that time, he lived, or he had lived, he had just recently moved from the corner of Broadway and Main. He was an associate justice at that time of the Minnesota Supreme Court, but still found time to spend time in Winona serving on the library board. A guy named E.A. Gertzen, interesting case because he was a German. Most of these early folks on the library board were what we might call Yankees. But he was a German, born in Germany, but he had been the clerk of district court for 17 years, and he was a probate attorney. William Allen was another member of this board. He happened to be the municipal court judge. And then there was a woman named Mrs. Marsfield. I haven't been able to find out much about her, but I know she was married to a leading grain merchant in town. And the other three members of the board were the three women who had saved the library in 1875. Charlotte Prentice, of course, and Louise Wilson, who was married to Thomas Wilson, who was at one point the Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court and later represented this district in the House of Representatives in Washington, and Abigail McGawkey, who was the wife of a doctor in town. So this is the kind of people, this is kind of a snapshot, a little social snapshot of what the kind of people who cared enough about the library not just to donate to it, but actually to be involved day to day in the running of it. And imagine how different things might be today if the same kind of people took the same kind of interest in the library. Things might look a little different. So that's point one. This is part of this larger social involvement by wealthy and powerful people in public institutions like the library. Secondly, I wanted to just observe that this was a big gift. So the reason I think it's important to mention this is that William Laird started off and said he set aside $40,000 to build this building. It turned out it cost $50,000 to build the building. And so then the question is, okay, we know that $50,000 in 1897 is not the same as $50,000 today, right? We know that. But then the question is, well, what is it? And so historians it's a difficult problem. I mean, what I want to say to you, unfortunately, is there's no simple answer to that question. You're probably all familiar with the Consumer Price Index, which is what's commonly used to adjust for inflation, et cetera. If you use the Consumer Price Index, $50,000 in 1897 translates to about $1.5 million today. So, but that's the most conservative way of doing it. Other people have said, well, the Consumer Price Index is really not a good way of judging the comparative value of a building project. Labor costs would be a better way of doing it. If you did that, then you get a much higher figure, maybe as high as $10 million. So basically, there's no answer to this except to say, when you're talking about comparative worth over time, it's good to think of it in terms of a range. So I guess I would say Laird's gift to the city of Winona was at least $1.5 million, and really very likely worth a lot more than that, up to something like $10 million in today's dollars. And this was a gift to the city with no strings attached, but requiring the city to support this institution in perpetuity. It's an interesting thing to think about it. Can something like that happen again? I wonder. Thirdly, I wanted to mention, and maybe some of you already thought of this now, well, there was something else going on about this same time where another rich guy had libraries in mind. You thought about that? So Andrew Carnegie did, I think, maybe the single most spectacular act of philanthropy in American history when he gave about $42 million, again, this is $42 million around the turn of the century, to fund 1,600 libraries across the United States. And in that 1,600 libraries, there were 66 in Minnesota. Of those 66 Carnegie libraries in Minnesota, 22 are still being used as libraries. The other 44 have either been repurposed for some other purpose or have been demolished. All right. Now, this was a lot of giving, and Carnegie set up a system for doing this because it was kind of hard. How do you make 1,600 gifts? That's a lot of giving. And so he had a secretary, James Bertram, who ran this system, and the system was basically this. They said, okay, for every town that applied for a Carnegie grant, we would take your population based on the latest U.S. Census and double it. So if your population was $10,000, you get a $20,000 Carnegie library. And that was it. You couldn't bargain. That was what you were going to get. And there was two conditions, kind of like what Laird did. First, you had to have a suitable site for it that the population agreed upon. So if everybody was fighting about where the thing was going to go, it wasn't going to happen. He wasn't going to give you the money. And secondly, he said you had to send 10% of the gift aside for annual maintenance of the library. So if the gift was $20,000, the city council had to agree to set aside $2,000 a year for maintenance. All right? So that's what happened. So Laird did basically a similar thing. But William Harris Laird made this gift to Winona in 1897, 2 years before the first Carnegie Library grant in Minnesota, which happened to be in Duluth in 1899. So actually it was before the Carnegie libraries had begun. But I think probably Laird was influenced by Carnegie, who was obviously well known, to say the least. And Carnegie had written a famous couple of articles called The Gospel of Wealth several years earlier, and probably people like William Laird had read it. And there was this famous piece where he said that the wealthy hold money really just in stewardship for the common good, and after taking care of the needs of their families, etc., they should give it all away. And that the man who dies rich has committed a sin, he said. So he was probably influenced by this, but he predated it. And the other thing that was interesting is that Laird had a system also like Carnegie, but in a way it was kind of a better system. So Laird started off by offering, talking with his nephew about a $40,000 building, which is exactly what Carnegie would have offered Winona, because Winona's population was 20,000 at the time. But because the architect on the project was his dear nephew, Warren Powers Laird, you get this back and forth for 2 years. Well, dear Uncle William, don't you think we really should have this beautiful dome in this building? And don't you think it should be this beautiful white Bedford stone on this building? And so Bell and Laird would get these estimates, take them to the local contractors. The contractors say, we can't do that for $40,000. It'd be $50,000. And they went back and forth. Eventually, William Harris Laird decided to go with his dear nephew and spent $50,000 on this building. So what happened is, this building is really more extravagant, more beautiful really, than your typical Carnegie library, if you think about it. Carnegie libraries are wonderful, but if you go around the state, you'll notice that they're almost always brick. They're hardly ever stone. And usually, there won't be a dome like this with that beautiful art glass. In fact, Andrew Carnegie would have said, that's an extravagance. I'm not paying for that. You want to do that, that's fine, but I'm not paying for that. I'm paying for a basic library. But here we got something much better because of really the commitment of William Harris Laird to kind of participate in this process with his nephew and move in the direction of building this building that they all were going to really be proud of for a long time. So now we get to the question of why? Why did he do this? Why were Winonans so involved in civic engagement, wealthy Winonans? Why did William Harris Laird make this great donation to the city? And there's probably lots of reasons, and it's hard to sort them all out. Some people have said, well, hey, this is not so hard to figure out. It was basically self-interest. At that time, there was lots of class struggle, militant union activity, et cetera, and some of the wealthy people wanted to give libraries to distract working people from socialism, et cetera. It's one argument that's sometimes made. At the very least, obviously, they were using their giving to create a society modeled on their own values, which was very much based on this sort of high culture of art and literature, et cetera. There's also the question of religion. So Laird and his partners came from this sort of Protestant tradition that suggested that one should not be too ostentatious about one's wealth and be very concerned about the common good in your community and take responsibility for it. One thing I wanted to note is that when someone like Laird gave a gift to the city of Winona of this library, keep in mind that he was really consciously enhancing a town that he was very much a part of, and even more than that, a neighborhood that he was very much a part of. And so by that I mean, he didn't just live here, he lived within a few blocks of here. And in fact, Laird and the Norton brothers all live within 2 or 3 blocks walking distance from the library. And, here, let me show you. I'll show you where they lived. This is Laird's house. It's gone now. All their houses are gone, unfortunately. 359 West 4th Street, so not too far, 2 or 3 block walk from here. And his partner, Matthew Norton, this is his house, 254 West 5th. It's also gone. It's the parking lot of the Y right now, that's what it is. And in fact, the Norton family donated the property to the Y when the new Y was built in the 50s. And then James Norton's house was at 275 West Wabasha. I think Central Lutheran kind of sits on top of where that used to be right about now. So you can see they were really in the neighborhood and right in this area. And it wasn't only them, but for example, Fred Bell lived on the edge of Wyndham Park, next to the Abner Hotchkiss house where Dave and Kathy Christensen live. Various of these folks, they all live within a short 2 or 3 block walk from here. But not only that, they all were very much interested in the Y, the YMCA, which was eventually in 1906 diagonal from this building. So right where Hardee's is now was where the Y was, which the Laird and Norton people all donated to a great deal. And then they were very much involved, the Laird family in First Congregational Church, obviously, just a block away. The Norton family at Central Methodist Church, even closer, right? And then later on, many of them were Masons, and they were involved in building the Masonic Temple, I guess in 1908, I think. And by the way, they brought Warren Powers Laird back to design it. And then finally in 1917, they built the Laird-Norton building right next door. So when I say that, what Laird was kind of enhancing his own neighborhood, this was kind of the Laird-Norton neighborhood, not only in terms of these institutions, but in the fact that they all lived within a few blocks away. So this is probably a factor too, something to think about. But it's all really speculation. So wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be a treat if we could sit down and speak with some of the folks who are mentioned in this history, with Fred Bell or whoever, right? I'm jealous sometimes, if you're doing some project where you're investigating some contemporary history, when obviously you can interview people who are actually involved. But it's harder to do here. It'd be really interesting to hear what Mr. Laird himself had to say about what motivated him to make this request. Unfortunately, I guess I'd need a time machine or something in order to do that. So I don't know what we can do. Good evening, sir. Can I be of assistance?
No, I happened to be taking a stroll through the neighborhood and I saw some activity in the library. Thought I'd see what was going on. Have I interrupted a costume party?
Well, actually, I was giving a lecture.
What might the topic be?
A history of the Winona Public Library and its benefactor, William Harris Laird.
Well, that sounds very interesting, but why are you not giving your talk in the meeting room in the downstairs?
Well, that room's now used as the children's library.
I feel a bit out of place. I feel like a character in the time machine. But perhaps I could stay and listen to the remainder of your talk.
Actually, you look like you might be able to provide some information to us. Your suit looks similar to the one Mr. Laird would have worn, and you bear an interesting resemblance to him. Would you happen to be familiar with him?
You might say I've known him since birth.
Are you from Union County, Pennsylvania?
I was born there in 1833.
And when did you come to Winona?
1855. I was getting pretty bored being a clerk in a store in Clintondale, Pennsylvania, a small and isolated community that had a very little opportunity and a lot of monotony connected to it. Two of my relatives, Catherine Gaut and my brother John, had settled in Winona in 1852, and getting out that way was becoming easier because there were more and more railroads and steamboats made the areas, accessible. Like many young men of my generation, I went west. I told Catherine Gaut in a letter that if I could be sure of making my fortune in Winona, moving there might be a good decision. Upon my arrival, things looked good, opportunities abounded, and I stayed.
So you are William Harris Laird.
At your service, sir. And who might you be?
I'm Greg Gaut. I'm just an historian, but I'm honored to make your acquaintance. Now, since we have you here, may I ask you a few questions about you and this building you underwrote?
I have a bit of time on my hands, so I can oblige you.
Well, we're really interested in what influenced you and what motivated you to give this building. Can you offer some insights?
Yes, and my origins had something to do with it. Most of the early settlers in Winona were Yankees, folks from Pennsylvania, New York, New England. The folks from Union County, Pennsylvania, and there were a good number of us, we were also Scots-Irish. And when we settled in Winona, we brought our social institutions and our mores along with our personal belongings with us. We were practical folk, deeply religious, and we had a great deal of love and respect for learning, which means literacy and access to books. In our house on West 4th Street, for example, we have a very commodious library in addition to our family altar. You know, I think it's work, church, and home were the three reference points for most of us. And the men especially had a greater than average education for those times. And we all knew how to cipher and read, which we used to our advantage. And we began to build Winona. We set about establishing schools and a library association. By 1866, we had both, plus a new cemetery, all the trappings of civilization for our small but growing river community. Now, of course, in those days, the Library Association charged a fee for membership.
Would you say Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth had an impact on your thinking?
Oh, I am familiar with Mr. Carnegie's views, and I do agree with them. Men of wealth have an obligation to use their money for the public good. Now, we've shown that we have the ability to succeed. So, what we need to do is build ladders of success for others to climb, as long as they use their own initiative to get on the ladder and climb to success. How do we accomplish that? We use our wealth to create public and private institutions, parks, artworks. During my years in Winona, I have endeavored to bring some of these things to fruition here in Winona. Well before Mr. Carnegie's essay, I contributed funds to many local projects. The library that I gifted to the city was operating before any of Mr. Carnegie's buildings existed in Minnesota. So you could say the Gospel of Wealth is something I practiced up, albeit more humbly and quietly than Mr. Carnegie.
Now, I read something about your involvement with a YMCA project concerning reading. Was this related to your library gift?
Oh, I think it had something to do with it. The YMCA is always promoting values that are important to a healthy society. And like me, they believe that the mind and the body had to be strong, pure, and healthy. I've been a long-time supporter of the YMCA, and this reading program you mentioned was especially important to me. It all began when the Laird Company began to build lumber camps. Now, men of all ages spent an entire winter in these camps with very little in the way of wholesome diversions. In the springtime, a flood of men emerged from the forest, headed to town with a lot of money in their pockets. Now, ideally, they should have put some of that money aside to prepare for life after the camps. That notion, unfortunately, was threatened by the temptations thrust into their path by unscrupulous parties trying to separate these men from their money and leave them nothing to show for it. In 1885 alone, there were 59 saloons in Winona. And I can guarantee you that they did not depend solely upon the locals for their business. One of the things I tried to do to combat this kind of thing resulted in my first library project. I built one at our timber facility up in Beef Slough near Alma, Wisconsin. And I can assure you, all of the reading material was wholesome and educational. The YMCA's reading program that really made a difference was their distribution of books and magazines to the lumber camps. In the spring, before the river breakup, these YMCA would send speakers into the camps, and they would talk to the men and offer them pamphlets on how to use their money wisely. But I was an enthusiastic supporter of this venture, and I encouraged my fellow lumbermen to contribute also. I appealed to their interest. A good Christian makes a good worker. Unfortunately, my pleas fell upon mostly deaf ears. But I continued to underwrite this project. You know, as an aside, I sometimes think that the wise emphasis upon strong minds and bodies influenced my getting to Carleton College. After all, I built a science building and a sports stadium. I practiced what I preached.
Did family members play a role in this process?
Our nephew, Warren Powers Laird, served as the architect for the library. I first met with him in 1894 at his office in Philadelphia, and we shared some ideas. By 1897, He had prepared a design based upon many of my suggestions for a new building. But the most influential member of the family in this regard was our son-in-law, Bill. He married our daughter and then began to work for the Laird Company. And he was involved in many civic projects. And one of the most important ones, he was the chairman of the Winona Public Library Board. Now, it was just about at this time that the movement for free public libraries was becoming a national one. And who should be one of its staunchest supporters? Mr. Bell. The city did have a taxpayer-financed library, but it was an old building, the old Monroe School at 4th and Lafayette Street, and it was a less than satisfactory site. It was old, it was cramped, the creature comforts were very few, and it was constructed entirely of wood. And believe me, I know the threat that fire poses to structures of that type. I watched almost this entire city get incinerated by a fire in 1862. In 1887, the Laird Mills burned to the ground, and in 1889, a huge amount of drying lumber was also consumed by flames. I wanted none of those experiences to repeat itself with our library. Winona needed a new, more spacious, fireproof building in which to house its book collection. Well, Mr. Bell prevailed upon me to help finance such a project, and the rest is history.
How about your experience as a businessman? Did this play a role?
Oh, I most definitely did. One of the first things I learned was to take care of details. And in my experience in the lumber business, I was constantly trying to reduce chaos and introduce order into the entire operation. And I also like to work behind the scenes, going about things that I did very quietly and efficiently. I also learned that you need to plan for the future. In the lumber business, if one did not keep up with change and technology, one became a minor player very quickly. I was also fortunate, and I have been fortunate, to be involved in business with men of foresight and good judgment and the breadth of vision, which allows them to overlook petty things which often obstruct the real interest of everyone concerned. And I used my experience working with them to frame my approach to work and other life duties. So I took the lessons that I learned and applied them to my library project. I proceeded cautiously, making sure that I first had a feasible plan in place before I announced anything. I secured an architect. I located a site for the building and found a way for the city to acquire that site. Then I figured out how to pay for the long-term maintenance of the facility. And until every one of these things was in place, I said nothing and did not present my proposal until everything was done. I didn't believe in a great deal of publicity while I was going about my planning, like a good poker player. I didn't show my cards until I was ready.
So it sounds like you're saying that you looked upon the new library as a way to thank Winona.
Mr. Gaut, I came to Winona when it was not even 4 years old. There were maybe 2,000-3,000 people living and working in wooden structures scattered along a sandbar that had only recently been surveyed and plotted. I was 22 years old, and I too was starting out in life. Winona and I grew together. We also suffered growing pains together, things like fires, floods, economic panics. Had we not surmounted all of those challenges, we wouldn't be here. And look at us now, a city of brick and stone and some wood, with a population of almost 20,000. I have worshipped, raised a family, prospered in business, and recreated here for almost 50 years. I took the advice of the preacher and the speaker, Mr. Russell Conwell, who in his famous speech, Acres of Diamonds, encouraged people to find wealth in their own backyard. All you had to do was believe and dig for it. Well, I believed in Winona, and I found my acres of diamonds here. I took some of those diamonds and I gave them back to the community in the form of Lake Park, West Lawn Cemetery, the Congregational Church and its manse, the YMCA and the Masonic Lodge. When my partners and I moved from our original homes down near our headquarters on 2nd Street, we moved to grander homes, all within walking distance of these buildings. And in addition to being in a central location, this library became part of our neighborhood too. When I presented the completed library in the city of Winona, I summed up my experiences in Winona in a letter, part of which read, "It takes me great pleasure to present this gift to the city where I have lived for so many years, and is the home of so many of my friends."
Well, thank you for being so generous with your time. Is there anything else you would like to add to what you've already told us?
No, but thank you for asking. I think I shall head back through that door into the early 20th century and continue my walk through the neighborhood, and possibly run into my good friend, cousin, and business partner, Mr. Matthew Norton, who often sits in his porch of an evening. We'll have a chat before I go home. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to a bit of history about how this building came to be. And please, keep putting my gift to good use. Good evening to you all.
Well, that was amazing. It was like a dream. It was like a dream come true, or maybe it was a dream. But in any case, I wish Laird could come back because we need him now, as we did in 1897. Now, as you see from the handout about the various chapters of the book, a lot of history's gone by since he gave Winona this building. I guess to sum that all up really quickly, the main thing you could say is that the demand for library services continued to grow over the 20th century and into the 21st century. And the kind of services the library offered multiplied. Imagine, for example, if Mr. Laird had wandered into the room with the public access computer terminals. What he would have made of that? Well, by the 1970s, libraries everywhere in the United States were starting to have problems, and Winona was typical. So there was an enormous growth in number of borrowers, in the size of the collection, in the circulation figures, and those things had begun to stretch the capacity of the 1899 building. There was also a serious problem, some of you will remember if you were around then, with the fact that the architecture of this building made it completely inaccessible to the handicapped, and really to the elderly too, for that matter, many people. And finally, funding became tighter and tighter, especially during the recessions of the early 70s and 80s. There was a long list of problems. And finally, there was a movement that developed. There was a lot of studies. There was all kinds of committees trying to decide what to do about our library. How could it be expanded? Should there be a new library, etc.? And because the library was kind of hemmed in by the schools on Broadway and by the auditorium building on this side, it looked to a lot of people that there was really no feasible way of expanding this building. And so there was lots of talk about building a new building. And finally, the city council voted unanimously to have a bond referendum to fund a new building. This was in 1985 on the riverfront along 2nd Avenue at Huff. Really where the Sinclair Station, the American, were until recently. And this is the brochure from that. The city put out a brochure urging people to vote yes. The idea was a new single-story library on the riverfront would solve the accessibility problem. There would be a parking lot. There would be lots more room, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the little map. So here's the river up here. Here's 2nd Street. Here's Huff. Here's the existing interstate bridge. And here's the one-story building that was proposed to voters to support a bond referendum, about $3.7 million. And the city council, like I said, voted unanimously. The Friends of the Library were for it. The librarians were for it. All the committees were for it. And it was defeated by a 4-to-1 majority. It was quite a shock to people. It lost in every single precinct. And it may or may not be a coincidence, but all of the incumbents on the city council who were up for election that year were defeated also. Well, the voters spoke with, I guess you could say, a certain amount of clarity about the bond referendum, but the day after the election, all the problems that the library had were still there. They were still inaccessible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So City Council then had to deal with that, and this led eventually to the addition that we have and the new entrance on Johnson Street, and the elevator, which made the place accessible, but it was not a very big addition. The library that was proposed in the referendum would have brought the library up to about 30,000 square feet of usable space. And with this addition, the library today is at about 12,000 square feet of usable space. So that was 1989 when that addition was completed. And guess what? A quarter century has gone by since then. And all that's happened really is that demand for library services and the variety of library services that librarians provide have continued to increase. So today, this library serves 3 times as many borrowers as it did in 1914. Today, the collection, the materials this library owns are 3 times as large as what the library owned in 1914. Today, the circulation figures for this library, over 300,000 per year, are 3 times what they were in 1914. Meanwhile, funding for the library has not kept pace and actually has shrunk. So, once again, what happens is, like with the recessions in the 70s and 80s, with the Great Recession in 2008, the library suffers serious cutbacks. In 2008, for example, the library director position was eliminated. And then it never quite rebounds after those cutbacks. So if you were to take, as I did, the library's budget, the amount the library had budgeted and spent in 2008, and adjust that for inflation to 2014, last year, what you'd find is that the library had $400,000 less to spend than what that 2000 budget would have been if it had been brought up to 2014. And so what that has meant is that limited hours and Winona's hours of service are less than many other libraries in the Southeast region. I'm sure you've read in the paper stories about the problems with acquisition of new materials, and those budgets being cut back to practically nothing, and using reserve funds to make up the difference. And really, using those reserve funds then means that there's no nest egg being built up for possible expansion. So we can't bring back William Harris Laird. Well, Ray can, but we can't. Or Fred Bell, or Charlotte Prentice. But we can follow their example. We can join the Friends of the Library. I thank them for making this all possible. We can encourage the city and county to better fund the library. We can encourage philanthropy, both small and large, to the library. We may not have as much money as William Harris Laird, but if we care about the library as much as they did, then this library will have a great future. Thank you very much.